So last October, I attended a poetry festival, and a poet there, Gideon Young, read a poem that I'd like to share with you today. And he introduced it by saying, this is a poem about the first house that I lived in with my wife. The Roach. Rejected, squalors in its desolate depression. Look at me, it wants to say, my black coffee iridescence, legs crooked and strong like crickets, wings for emergencies. How I can sustain on oils from your thumbprint for weeks, not to mention my nuclear infamy, my skitter speed. I only shun the light because you are cruel, your fear blinding, your intricate limbs so quick to violence, murder. So Gideon finished that poem and said, I'm going to read it to you again. This is a poem about people being bugs under America's boot. The Roach. Rejected, squalors in its desolate depression. Look at me, it wants to say. My black coffee iridescence, legs crooked and strong like crickets, wings for emergencies. How I can sustain on oils from your thumbprint for weeks, not to mention my nuclear infamy, my skitter speed. I only shun the light because you are cruel, your fear blinding, your intricate limbs so quick to violence, murder. So did you notice what he did there? He read the same poem twice. And the first time in his introduction, he emphasized the literal, the roach. And the second introduction, he emphasized the metaphor, the people being bugs under America's boots. And that introduction is so short, shorter still than an already short poem, but it changes how we experience the poem. The introduction changes the frame on the poem. And frames can be very powerful, and frames are subtle. Frames, if we think about them in their most literal sense, if we think about artwork, they tell us what to focus on. We can focus on what's inside the frame, and they tell us what to ignore. We can ignore what's outside the frame. And we tend to just look at the art. We don't tend to look at the frame itself. So it's subtle, it's there. We tend not to question it. But I also think because the frames aren't questioned, that also makes them incredibly powerful, because we don't tend to say, is this what we should be looking at? So I think there's a lot of power in changing the frame. And so what I want to do is spend the next few minutes talking about 3 ways that we can change the frame, and then looking at some examples from the world of learning. Does anybody know this painting? It's by Bruegel the Elder, and the title of the painting is Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. So that title focuses us down on the right-hand corner where we see Icarus's legs disappearing into the sea. So I think that the title reframes the picture. It zooms us in to a particular detail. It makes us focus on something that was already in the frame. So similar to how Gideon's introduction to his poem reframed it, focused us on a certain aspect, that's what we're doing here. So what could this look like in the learning world, this idea of zooming in on something that's already in the frame? Well, if we think about kind of the stakeholders in a typical learning experience, we have the learners themselves, we might have the employers of those learners, we have the subject matter experts, we have the instructors, we have the facilitators, we have the subject matter experts. We have all these people, and maybe some others in your particular frame. And so when I talk about, though, is Udemy, which came up this morning. And so Udemy was founded, several years ago, I think 2010. But they focused in on part of those stakeholders in its frame. They sort of said, look, we know that we have instructors and subject matter experts that are part of our frame. But if we zoom in on them, if we kind of focus in on them, we can provide more value to them. Arguably today, it is not that hard if you are a subject matter expert or an instructor with just a little bit of tech savvy. You can put out online courses, digital content. Now that said, there's a difference between creating the content and then actually marketing and selling it. And so that can be a real hurdle for subject matter experts and instructors who are fine putting together content, getting it ready, but they don't know how to go about finding a market for it, especially a paying market. And so that was a pain point for subject matter experts and instructors. And Udemy said, hey, that can be our opportunity. So they zoomed in, provided ways to not only create and publish the content, but then they said, hey, look, we have this huge marketplace of learners. We'll market to them, we'll sell it for you, we'll keep a percentage in exchange. But the subject matter experts and instructors are willing to take that trade because that allows them to focus on what they know most, the subject matter expertise, and they get help on sort of the operational and the marketing side of it. So I think that's an example of a company really focusing in on a particular aspect of the frame, so zooming in. Now, another way to change the frame then it would be to zoom out, right? So we just zoomed in, we can zoom out. So you might have something in a frame that just looks like, bucolic trees and a pond, but if you zoom out, then you see you're actually in the middle of New York City. So by picking up and enlarging the frame, we can take note of things and exploit those and use those to our advantage. So for an example of this in the learning world, I want to look at microlearning. I think humans, for a very long time, probably arguably since the beginning of Homo sapiens, have been learning in little bits and pieces at the point of need. That said, there's been a recent explosion in microlearning. And it's driven by technology, yes. We have the near ubiquity of smartphones. We have improvement in internet access and internet speed. So yes, technology is part of it. But I also think part of the explosion in the realm of microlearning has to do with the fact that there are organizations that have zoomed out to put microlearning within the frame of what they do in terms of learning and education. And so, again, seems like, microlearning is going to just keep growing and growing. So as one example, I want to use, one of the organizations that we have here, the Ohio Society of CPAs, that launched its Quick Bites program this year. And so that is for certified public accountants who can get continuing professional education now in increments of as short as 10 minutes. So what's interesting is I think that OSCPA was looking at its learners and realized, okay, we have learners, we have accountants who are doing micro-learning. They're out there using YouTube, they're doing whatever they're doing to get what they need to know in just short little bits. But they weren't getting credit for that, and they weren't coming to the Ohio Society of CPAs for that necessarily. And so OSCPA did what they needed to do to talk with AICPA, talk with other state associations, work with the state board in Ohio to actually get the credit approved for that, and basically did all the logistics that they needed to bring that within the realm of what they offer, to zoom out, to include the micro-learning there and be able to offer it out. Now, the third way, so we've talked about zooming in with like Udemy focusing on the subject matter experts and instructors. We talked about zooming out to kind of see micro-learning, pull that into the frame. The third way then would be to put a frame where there currently is no frame. And so this visual example is there's some teachers doing what I think is a brilliant thing with graffiti in their school. So this was written on a bathroom wall in a school. And so what the teachers do basically is frame it by adding a little artist note, so this is Vive la Révolution, artist unknown, and it says pencil on sheetrock and all of that. So it's this great thing of you take something that was sort of unframed, put a frame around it, and it changes the perspective that we have on it. And so the example that I want to use here in terms of the realm of learning is the third sector of education. We've talked about it a little bit this morning. I just want to talk about it a little bit more. But there's this idea that we spend a certain amount of time kind of in K-12 education. We maybe go on and do some higher ed. But then there's this large expanse of time, basically, between when we finish that formal education and when, well, not to be morbid, but when we die. And that's, what we've called the other 50 years. And it actually seems like the 50 years is going to just keep getting longer. Life expectancies are getting longer. People are staying in jobs longer. We have an increasing rate of change. And so all of that means that we need to learn longer, we need to learn more, and the shelf life of the knowledge that we gain is shorter. So all of that means that we really have a need for what associations offer, for what other organizations offer, for workforce development type activities, all of those things. And so we have that out there, but if we put it in the frame, if we say, this is the third sector of education, I think it begins to legitimize what we're doing. It begins to focus attention, and it begins to take these perhaps what seem like disparate things, associations and continuing education at universities and colleges, and by putting them within the same frame, we begin to see it differently. We begin to see this is a place where we can invest. This is a place where we can grow. So we've talked about the three ways, sort of zooming in, zooming out, and then putting a frame there. So what I want to do just to wrap up is to talk about some questions that I would offer for you to consider when you're thinking about, okay, how could I do zooming in, zooming out when I think about the marketing opportunities for my organization? So when you think about the zoom in, and like what Udemy did on focusing on subject matter experts and instructors, I think the question is, what are the components that create value and who values it? So when you have your learning and education business, really thinking about that. So the components might be things like the timeliness of what you offer and how you're really good at keeping people up to date. It might be the reputation of your subject matter experts. It might be the convenience of your offerings. Any of those components, you need to do that analysis and think about what those components are. And then think about who values it. So clearly you have learners as one of your stakeholders, but you might also have purchasers. Maybe you have people who purchase on behalf of learners in your organization. You have the subject matter experts, you have the instructors. So beginning to think about what are those components of value and then who values it. And so then like Udemy, you can focus in and say, okay, we can offer value to this particular segment of our stakeholders, and this is how we can do it. And so it's just can be helpful because sometimes, of course, we need to be committed and focused on the learners, but sometimes there are other stakeholders, or maybe we're focused on the wrong component, and if we just shift, we might be able to zoom in and give some more emphasis there and make a change. Now, if you think about the zooming out, when what's something that's outside of your frame that you might want to include, I think the question is, what are the alternatives and substitutes to what you offer? And we need to do direct competitive analysis, yes, but I think we also need to look to the substitutes and alternatives. So it's not just about finding out what other courses or conferences our learners are going to. It's really thinking about, in general, how are they accessing knowledge? How are they learning? Which might have nothing to do with conferences or workshops. And so the way to do this, I think, is to observe your learners or your would-be learners, see how it is that they do access that information. Sometimes direct observation isn't always possible, but maybe there are ways. To supplement the observation, or if you can't do the direct observation, ask questions. But I think you have to be really careful about what questions you ask, because if you're going out and asking learners what other conferences did you attend, then you're putting that frame of conference around learning, and you're focusing your attention and their attention on that particular aspect of learning. You have to be careful about what you're asking there. But I think that with the micro-learning example, you can, if you're starting to look at how people are accessing knowledge, you can begin to see, okay, maybe there's something that we can pull in that we can begin to offer ourselves. And then the third question, if you're thinking about, okay, where would it make sense to put a frame, I think the question is are we cultivating an awareness and appreciation of the trends in the larger environment? And I think that we just have to be aware of what's going on, because once we can see the trends, then we can begin to recognize maybe there are aspects that it would make sense for us to put a frame around, to call particular attention to. When we do the Leading Learning podcast interviews, one of the questions we always ask people is, what are your own learning habits? How do you go about learning? And everybody has their particular little spin on it, but a large number of folks have all mentioned just how important it is to read broadly. And I think that's because we know that it's the intersection of domains, or the application of an idea from one domain to another, are often where the best insights come. So we need to be reading broadly. If you're at a loss for what to read, we have some things we can emphatically recommend if you would like. But in addition to doing the reading, you have to be also taking the time to think about what you've read, to begin to see those intersections, those connections, to begin to think about what would it look like to apply this in our organization. And so on top of reading it, on top of having that reflection time, I think then too you also need to be bringing together a group of people to have a discussion about that. Hopefully a group with diverse viewpoints and opinions come together to talk about what they're observing, what they're seeing, and the implications for what you're doing. So I think this is a really exciting time for the third sector of education. I think there's a tremendous amount of change, which is creating a tremendous amount of opportunity. And I think that our ability to see frames, to question the frame, to think about whether we need to change the frame by zooming in or zooming out or by putting a frame where there was one not before, I think all of that's going to be really key to how those of us in this room are able to see the market opportunities ahead of us and then to seize them. Thank you.